Does anyone use our speech enhancement system at home?
Yes.
You do? Yeah? Okay, what do you have at home? Do you have an ARC or?
The Arc Ultra.
The ARC Ultra? Perfect.
That's had the enhancement on medium.
Medium, okay, nice.
Because it has, this is the standard, the standard setting.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so we'll jump into sort of what the settings mean and how we design them. But yeah, it's good to know that you've got some background on this already. But we'll go into some of the sort of technical detail, how we created it, why we created it. So yeah, let's get going. So the new speech enhancement feature, it's been available on Arc Ultra since May 13th. And you know, our existing speech enhancement feature has been around for a long time. You know, the single toggle on and off, which for a long time has been good. You know, it's raised the level of dialogue in the center channel, and you know, it helps lift the dialogue out of a film, and it does improve intelligibility. But I think now, if we look at sort of mixing trends and everything, it's way more difficult to use that approach, and it's not a sustainable approach to us. So we actually had to change our tact a little bit as well. So we had to come up with a new solution, which essentially uses AI, which we'll get into shortly. But it's actually sort of really difficult to pin one reason as to why dialogue is becoming more and more difficult to understand. It's not just because of bad mixing. Sure, that could be one of the reasons. It's not just because you've got an echoey room, but it sometimes can be any one of these things or a combination. So, you know, if it's a bad mix and you've got a really echoey room, of course you're going to really struggle. So, you know, we actually did some internal research first of all when we started work on this feature, and we were really looking at 4 categories. So we were looking at the mix itself, so the content, the actual the content coming down the HDMI stream. We've also got the environment as well, so your living room where you're sitting. We've got the loudspeakers, which obviously for Sonos has never been a problem, but actually if we look at the issue holistically, you know, as an issue itself, then loudspeakers can be a problem. And then the listener themselves as well, so you know, what might be going on there. So if we look at the mix category, we've got filmmaker intent. You know, there are certain directors that like to bury dialogue, and you know, particularly we'll hear one in a demo scenario shortly. But you know, it can be creator intent. It can be, I don't want you to necessarily hear this dialogue super clearly because I want to play into the realism side of the scene. You know, we're in a bustling bar, so you know, you should be reaching to hear that dialogue. But actually, when you watch these kind of things at home, there are too many variables for you to actually understand the dialogue, you know, like you have an echoey room. So that can be a problem. Production errors as well. I used to sort of work in the film industry, so when you did mixes for cinema and when you did mixes for your streaming service, you know, those are 2 different mixes, because the one for home is like slightly more compressed and a little bit louder. Theatrical presentations are a lot more dynamic. So, you know, playing a theatrical film back on a soundbar would sound crazy. So sometimes, you know, you would send it to the studio and the wrong version might get put on, for example. So production error, that's the thing. Inferior mixing as well. You know, mixers these days, we hear a lot from the creator community that schedules have been, you know, really rushed and hurried by production, because a lot of this kind of conveyor belt TV is being sped up. You know, they've got, you know, a matter of hours to mix an episode of something, so you know, they literally have to run it and grab the faders as they go. So you know, that could really affect dialogue quality. And also, you know, the actors might have a dialect or shouldering, that kind of thing. And as we move on to environment, you could have a air conditioning unit in your room, you could have bad room acoustics, you could also have a boundary condition. Over to the loudspeaker as well, and you know, obviously for Sonos, you know, we look at our culture, and actually that's been completely redesigned from the ground up to prevent dialogue issues. But you know, as I said, looking at the problem holistically, we've got the sync could be off, you know, we've got center performance issues, the left center and the right channels might not be integrated properly, so you know, left and right might be a bit too loud, clouding that dialogue in the center channel. And then the listener themselves, you know, they might have set the volume too low, they could be off axis, they could be distracted. And a big one here for us is the fact that they could actually have a bit of hearing loss. So We worked with a charity, a deafness charity in the UK for this feature, which I'll get into shortly as well.
What is shouldering, by the way?
Shouldering is kind of when dialogue is kind of intentionally buried, so sort of like off-axis lines, kind of, it might be over-the-shoulder lines that could be like panned between the centre and the right channels, and then if you've got bad LCR integration and one channel is not EQ'd or tuned properly, then that can cause a big issue, yeah. So, really, what can we do about it? You know, what you know, looking at all of those reasons, what can we actually sort of, what solutions can we provide to this problem? Well, I think first it's interesting to look at multi-channel mixes as a whole. So, you know, what does each channel provide, and sort of why is there a problem there? So this is an incredibly crude mock-up of what you might find in the left, centre, and right channels of a film mix. But actually, you can consider the left and right channels to be any non-centre channel. So you can have some music in the surrounds. You can have some, you know, sound effects in the surrounds as well. So if it's 5.1, if it's 7.1, if it's Dolby Atmos, dialogue is more often than not found in the centre channel. So we've got some music and effects in left and right, and also in the surrounds as well. But also, as you can see in the centre channel, you often find other elements as well. So maybe the mixer has sort of popped some music in the frontal soundstage as well. But what you also often find in centre is Foley, which is all the sort of the footsteps, the clothes rustling and all that kind of thing. And the way that you'd mix a film, because all the Foley is shot afterwards, you will pan and you will process the Foley exactly the same so that it matches the dialogue. So it's believable that that person who is currently speaking, that is their feet. You know, you would EQ it to match the dialogue and put the same reverb on it and all that kind of thing. So essentially, we should in theory just be able to turn the centre channel up, but unfortunately everything else that is in that centre channel just comes up with it. So unfortunately this approach is a little bit subpar, doesn't really work for our application. And actually, just as a sort of like, as a side note, you know, when we were first initially testing this feature, we actually experimented with leaving the centre channel where it was, but actually lowering all of the other channels. You know, we were thinking that could clear up the centre channel slightly. But then if you play any non-dialogue scene through that processing, it just loses all impact. It loses all kind of, you know, any action scenes, any car chases, music montages, that kind of thing, completely loses its power and its punch. So really, we had to look at another solution. And we had a very interesting development process on our culture. We realized that we had more processing available than we had ever had on a soundbar. So it was super exciting for us, and we saw an opportunity here to implement new technology. So, you know, we asked ourselves, well, kind of, what if you can just pull speech out of the centre channel? What if we can actually separate that somehow? So having the speech separated using source separation is, or was, an incredibly big step forward for us. So for me, it's like there's two main reasons as to why this is the case. So firstly, we had control over it. So there was now a separate volume slider for dialogue, which is amazing. You know, we had total flexibility over how much we needed to draw out. But secondly, for me, I think this is probably the more important one, is that we knew when dialogue was happening. So if there is content on this extracted channel, we can go, okay, this is a dialogue scene. So that was a huge revelation for us. It's contextual information as well. I don't know if you remember me saying earlier that, you know, when we pulled all of the channels down and played an action scene, it just completely died and it, you know, lost all of its impact. But actually, if we have some clues as to whether dialogue exists, then maybe this feature can be slightly more dynamic in nature. Maybe it can react to whether dialogue is happening or not. So that's what we did. And, you know, I think getting all of this balance right as well was really important. So the sort of needs and requirements of people being able to understand dialogue, you know, versus the actual creator intent, that is, you know, that's a huge gulf, right? Because if you look at the people who have sort of mixed the films and they say, you know, why are you altering the levels of my mix, versus someone who's got a big air conditioning unit and some hearing loss, there's two different requirements there. You know, they're mixing for the blockbuster films, they're mixing with director breathing down their neck, saying, make my dialogue sound like this, but then the other person is like, but I can't hear it. So those two things we really had to balance, and we really lent on our creator community to tell us what that balance should be, because there was a huge consensus throughout of, you know, all of the mixers and all of the content creators out there, that dialogue should be understood, and it's fine to sort of take some creative license with where we could take that. So earlier I mentioned some work in the hearing loss space, and we worked incredibly closely with this organisation here, which is the RNID, which is the Royal National Institute for Deaf People. And they're actually experts in the field of hearing loss. And they have this huge pool of people who we were really able to lean on and do listening experiments with them. You know, when we were developing the feature, was it doing the right thing? Was it solving the problem? And, you know, as we were progressing the feature on, you know, we were able to sort of check in with them and show them the tunings, and they would then understand, you know, okay, this is helping me, this isn't helping me. And yeah, we learned so much from these sessions, you know, it completely invaluable. I don't think this feature would have been as successful if it wasn't for them. For instance, you know, we learned that hearing loss is, obviously it's super complex and very, very individual as well. When we talk about deafness or hearing loss, you know, it might be that, you know, people have asymmetric hearing loss, which is, you know, they might have minus 20 dB in their right ear, but the left ear is okay, and that's hearing loss. And we might have more mild hearing loss that we need to think about, and way more severe as well. And people want the ability to tailor their experience. You know, they want the ability, they want the choice, they want, you know, they want the flexibility when it comes to the content that they're watching. The RNID participants, they generally preferred higher levels of enhancement. So, you know, they wanted that dialogue to be pulled out. But the key thing here is that they really didn't want the non-dialogue scenes to be sacrificed. So, you know, it's that age-old problem of constantly picking up the remote and turning it up, and then when it's a loud scene, you turn it back down again. So that was a huge thing. Like, you turn up the dialogue scene to understand it, and then when the dialogue scene is over and it's a big explosion, you turn it right back down again because it's too loud. So we knew that this is actually something we needed to consider as well, you know, for this audience, because one of the things that we really understood with the RNID work is, you know, we know that people with hearing loss struggle at low levels to understand what's being said. But actually what we learned was they struggle at the other end as well. If you imagine your hearing range, and, you know, this is the sort of threshold of perception, and that's the threshold of pain, for them it shrinks, because, you know, actually loud sounds to you and I might not be so bad. It's actually painful for them because their thresholds have been dramatically reduced. So we knew that in this dynamic feature, it should sort of contain some of those louder sounds as well. So it's a comfortable listening experience. So actually, it became way bigger than just a dialogue enhancement tool. It became almost this, you know, as we go up the levels, which I'll describe shortly, but it sort of became a feature for the hearing loss crowd, which is amazing, and we definitely couldn't have done it without the RNID. And I think the way that I like to describe this feature, you know, I keep talking about it being dynamic, but it's almost like a sort of a focus on a camera. You know, if you imagine what's important in front of you, we're managing to focus the dialogue when it's important. But then if there is no dialogue, we're able to actually change the focus to suit the background better. So nothing or very little is lost in those lower levels. As we then come up the levels, you know, into the high and the max settings, that's when we can actually start, you know, the background sounds can start taking a bit of a backseat in favour of dialogue as well. But we'll get to that shortly. The other thing the RNAD were really amazing at doing is, you know, we worked with them a lot with obviously understanding the requirements for the hearing loss crowd. But the other thing that we really work with them is sort of when do we provide enhancement? You know, it's a very sort of it's a bit of a tightrope, because you know that background voice in that bar scene, should that be heard? You know, if we're actually defining sort of ideal performance from the feature, do we want to enhance that background voice? Well, we sort of came up with this dialogue spectrum, and the spectrum goes all the way from a scene with no dialogue, you know, think music montage or action sequence, to a scene with only dialogue, completely clean, imagine voiceover with no music at all. And so on this slide, you can kind of see some examples of where you might want to enhance some dialogue, right? So, as I said, it could be sort of a music montage with no dialogue, and then, yeah, clean voiceover with no background sounds. But there is an absolute gulf of content that exists, you know, within that. So as we move up the scale, you could have an action scene with some crowd voice reactions. So think, you know, those like car chases with market stalls and someone yells out in the background, and you know, we don't need to enhance that. That's not plot critical. So, I mean, sorry, I should say on the y-axis here is the action that we would ideally want to take. And then as we move up the scale, you know, you've got background voices in a bar scene with a bit of music. Again, we're not looking to enhance that, really only primary dialogue in that scenario. Then if we start looking at kind of maybe the scenes that, you know, dialogue is slightly buried, but we do want to hear those principal actors and they are present in that moment, we're going to start looking at enhancing that kind of stuff. And then a prime example of, you know, where we'd probably do the most enhancement is when, you know, it's a sort of hard to hear bar scene or something like that. And then we come back down again, and there's like, obviously speech gets cleaner. So this really kind of illustrates the fact that this is really completely dynamic, and, you know, it's very reactionary to whatever the content is. So we, using the extracted AI signal, you know, this kind of source separated signal, you know, we can compare that to the original center channel, and we can say, what is the energy difference there? So if there is no correlation between extracted and the original center channel, then we know that there is either no dialogue or only dialogue, right? Sorry, we know that there is no dialogue, because if there's nothing on that extracted channel but there's loads of energy on the center channel, we don't do anything. But if it matches exactly, that means the speech is clean, because it's pulled out exactly what matches the center channel. But then if we reverse a little bit and the speech is about 4 or 5 dB below that, that's when we provide the most enhancement. So it truly is and there's a lot of maths going on under the hood to sort of do a lot of calculations on what that ratio looks like, really. So integrating everything that we learned from the RID and the development that we had done, we came up with 4 levels, essentially. So it goes all the way from low to maximum. So, you know, we're really designing this feature, you know, first to hold artistic intent where possible, whilst improving that speech intelligibility, hopefully really without the user really understanding how it's being done. It's just like the dialogue is just popping, essentially. They're just understanding and comprehending it without much effort, really. So the first 2 levels, you know, these are for sort of maybe more typical listeners and typical environments, but low could get you over the edge for kind of maybe a blockbuster movie at home where you're just slightly reaching for the dialogue. This is going to get you over the line. It's still going to preserve all of the background sounds. It's going to be pretty intact, and it's pretty faithful to the original intent as well. It adds emphasis with the strict requirement of preserving that original experience. So really for normal listening environments, targeted primarily to correct for sort of those typical mix issues, if you remember that column on the left. So anything like the mix there's an error in the mix, or it's slightly inferior mixing, low could get you over the edge to be able to understand that without much impact on the sound experience. Then as we go and move into medium, this is sort of a better sounding version of our on-off switch that we used to have. So it's a better sounding version of our traditional speech enhancement system, You know, we may slightly deteriorate the cinematic experience to a small degree to sort of favour dialogue in certain moments, but only to a small degree. And you should really still get that immersion, and you should still get all of the effects. So again, targeted for situations that might start to be a sort of combination of mix, environment, and sort of maybe listener issues as well. So you might have some very mild hearing impairment with this feature. And then as we get into high, you know, these last two levels are really for impaired listeners or less than ideal environments. So you could have a really echoey room. You could have sort of you know, you could have a big sound obstruction in the way or something like that. You know, we're really entertaining the idea that you really do need help with dialogue at this point. So the level assumes sort of mild to medium impairment or a severe combination of sort of other root causes as well. This level really does provide a sort of noticeable dynamic range control, so we're really clamping down on making sure that things are audible, but they're not jumping out. So we're obviously having to boost stuff to make it audible, but we're not sort of, it is all very, very controlled. And then as we move up into max, this level was really developed exclusively for, you know, hearing impaired users or a really kind of severe environment. You know, it would, if you're engaging max, you're sort of signifying that you are really, really struggling with the dialogue. So yeah, hearing impaired users, and this is the level that we worked with most with the Royal National Institute of Deaf People as well. So we really had to understand those unique requirements, which I touched on earlier. So dialogue delivery and dynamic range control are really the most important aspects, allowing this group to follow a story with little effort, really.
When you're doing all this intelligent stuff, do you prioritize the environment first or the listener when you do the speech enhancement?
It's a good question. I think it's kind of a mixture, because I think if you're engaging this feature at all, it's you're sending a signal to us that you can't understand the dialogue. So I think a lot of what I've described and the processing that we're applying, sort of the dynamic range control, the dynamic EQ that we're applying, we're also sort of ducking non-center channels to make sure that dialogue really pops. We're trying to look at those sort of reasons why, you know, someone might need speech enhancement, such as this. So we're trying to look at all of these and go, because we don't know, that's the thing, we don't know why the listener is engaged it. So we're trying to kind of help out. And I think, you know, the mix, the environment and the listener, we can really help out with this feature. So it's sort of all of them. we're trying to understand, and we're trying to sort of, you know, help in most environments. Yeah.
And would you get to a point where it becomes dynamic? So like, for example, during the daytime, obviously the environment sounds a bit louder compared to nighttime. So instead of having to change the levels all the time, can it become dynamic, that it kind of intelligently notices what time of day it is, what's going on, etc.?
Yeah, I mean that would be the dream, but we try and be intelligent in the content that comes down the HDMI. So we're trying to understand what's coming down there, reading the signals, you know, sort of taking contextual information from that, and then applying the right amount of enhancement for whatever the listener's chosen. Cool. Any other? You will hear it shortly, but we're gonna touch on the Sonos Ace software developments first. But so, any other questions for now on the speech enhancement work?